Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Aftercolor webinar series. Today we have Thibault Roland once again. He's presented twice, maybe three times for us. Today we have long exposure, bridging fine arts and photography. Thibault's going to take questions throughout the webinar. Feel free to send them in. And Thibault, welcome back and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very excited to be again presenting for BenQ. And thank you everyone for being here today. I hope that you'll see how I'm excited about long exposure and fine art photography, and that I'll be able to convey a little bit of that excitement and make you want to explore a little bit more about those two topics and concepts. So uh, today I'm going to start very briefly by introducing myself. As you probably can hear, I'm not from around here. I'm originally from France, based in Portland, Oregon currently. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery, and I would define myself as being a fine art photographer, specializing in seascapes, architecture, and landscape. Um, a lot of what I do is black and white photography, although this is somewhat changing, or this has been changing recently. And a lot of it is still very much focused on using the technique of long exposure, and hopefully you will realize very soon why I'm so much in love with this technique. Okay, so first of all, let's talk a little bit about fine arts. Let's step away for just a second from photography and just talk about fine arts in general. So what really is specific to fine arts is that it's highly subjective. It's completely tied to a personal vision and expression, a personal interpretation of, you know, a subject, an idea, a project, anything you can think of. It has nothing to do with documenting reality, which means that you really want to step away from reality and create something that potentially will be very, very, very different from what you see in the real world in a way. And what really matters is the final product. It's not how you got there. It's not what tools you used to get there. It really focuses on what is the final result, what the final object is. I like to show these two examples here because on the left-hand side, you see these very, very famous set of portraits of Marilyn Monroe by Andy Warhol. There's a little bit of controversy around those portraits. I'm not going to go into that. But what I wanted to call out was that this is originally a photograph that has been changed, manipulated to essentially fit the vision of Andy Warhol at the time that he had of Marilyn Monroe. Obviously, she didn't look like what you're seeing on the screen right there, but this was the way that Andy Warhol had to interpret and transcribe his personal vision of the Marilyn Monroe character in a way. And on the top right-hand side here, you have a set of images by this mostly but not only French painter from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And as you can see, he was not just a painter. He also did some sketching, did some very early on photography. He did some sculptures. And as you can see, all of these basically are focused on a common theme, a common subject, which was very personal to him. In this case, dance and dancers. So again, really art is very subjective and is going to be the important thing about fine art is the result and what you're obtaining out of the whole process of creation. That being said, tools are actually important, but they're important in a way that they're there to enable your vision to come to life. They're not there just because it's cool to have this new toy. Of course, it's cool to have this new toy, and I'm very much like that as well. But at the end of the day, what I want is to be able to share the picture that I imagined in my mind, that I created based on what I'm seeing. And you will see in the next few slides how um, much how far sometimes I can actually take this idea forward. So let's start a little with talking a little bit about what the technique of long exposure is in photography. If you're asking different people, you will have slightly different definitions, but overall, I would say that in photography, long exposure corresponds to the use of a slow shutter speed as well as the personal vision that you will be using in order to capture images on a specific substrate. And that can be photo paper, it can be film if you're shooting film, it can be the sensor if you're using digital camera, anything like that, right? But what's important here is that we're going to be using one, a slow shutter speed, and two, it's going to be tied to that personal vision that I've been talking about that is very much tied to the fine art aspect of photography. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you a few examples of what to expect uh, in terms of effects from the technique of long exposure. Over here, you have basically an example of a tree that I shot in Eastern Washington. That particular picture, you can think of it as being handheld. You know, it's just a regular shutter speed. And as expected, as you're, I'm sure, very familiar with it, you can see how the tree, the clouds, everything is basically frozen in time with this very fast shutter speed. Now, if I'm using a very, very slow shutter speed, instead of using 2/50th of a second or a fraction of a second, I'm using many, many seconds. I'm actually, in this case, using about 4-minute long exposure. And you can see how now the vision, the effect is completely different on that subject. The very first thing you can see is actually how the tree is moving in the wind. And because it's moving in the wind while the shirt is actually remaining open, that is going to blur out the leaves and the branches that are moving during that time. And it's exactly the same thing that happens with clouds. Clouds will be moving in the sky more or less slowly, but 4 minutes are long enough that the clouds will have traveled a fairly significant distance, and they will turn into those really, really cool, very soft streaks that you can see in the background of that image. So as you can see here already in this one subject, you are able to create something that is going to be very different already from what you can see um, in the field at your time scale. The other really cool thing about long exposure is that it's a technique that's really powerful to essentially blur out, if not entirely remove, people that may be walking in the field of view that you're shooting. And this is exactly what you're seeing over here. The picture on the top, it's a fraction of a second. Again, think of it as being handheld, while at the bottom, I'm using, again, a very slow shutter speed, about 3 minutes, to blur out people. They're not blurred out to the point that they're completely removed. I would have had to use an even longer shutter speed for that, but that's really the idea behind it there. Okay, here's another example of what long exposure will do for you. Again, this is an example of handheld picture where everything is frozen in time. You can see how the blades, the wings of that wind turbine are very, very sharp. if you're slowing down your shutter speed to about half a second, now you're starting to see how the movement of that wind turbine can be integrated back into your image. So you're transforming that medium that intrinsically two-dimensional into into having a third dimension, which is time. So now you're able to bring back the movement in your picture because you're able to blur out what is moving in that picture. And that's what you see over here. Another really interesting effect of long exposure is that you're able to essentially de-emphasize, to remove distracting elements. And this is exactly what you're seeing here in the foreground, where on the left-hand side picture, again, a fraction of a second, as usual, everything is frozen in space and in time. But you can see how every single blade of the weeds here are very detailed and are actually taking away from the main subject in the picture, which is the building over here. But on the right-hand side, where I'm using 5-minute long exposure, everything gets really blurred out, and you can see still some really cool patterns, but they're not overpowering anymore, and they're not taking away from the building at that point. Uh, if you push this even further, you can really simplify an image and go entirely minimalistic with that image. You can see how on the right-hand side, I'm using 4-minute long exposure and I'm removing all the details in the waves. I'm removing all the details also in the clouds. And this is transforming my image into this really, really easy to read photograph and pretty much into a minimalistic image at that point, which is even more the case in these two examples where you have these trees that are actually in the water, and because those are pretty much the only things, the only subjects in the picture, it's very, very easy to read, and it's transforming those images into minimalistic, highly minimalistic visions. So if you now look at all these different ideas and all that long exposure opens up for you, at the end of the day, really what it does is that it allows you to create completely unique looking images that are going to be very different from what you're seeing in the field as a photographer. And now it's going to, how to say, the game is for you to start thinking about, well, what do you have that you're seeing, that you're capturing, and how you can transform this into something different, into something that's going to be very personal to you. And one thing that I really want to kind of stress out, even though we're not going to have enough time to go too deep in there, is that the only way that you're going to be able to shoot long exposure during the daytime is by using something that's called a neutral density filter. Very often people will ask me, well, what kind of neutral density filter should I get? Should I buy a variable filter? My answer to that is typically you don't really want to buy variable filters because, as you can see in this particular image, variable filters will create this cross-like pattern in your image. And it will also create potentially some diffraction patterns as well that you can see over here and in the corners with these hot spots. So this is really something that you want to avoid. And to avoid this, my recommendation is to use either plain or graduated filters. Graduated filters are those filters that you can see here in the middle. They're typically used when you're shooting for instance, seascapes the where the sorry about that, where the sky, I'm trying to find my words, where the sky will have a luminosity that's going to be much, much higher than the luminosity of the waves, for instance. And so this is really going to help you there. But generally speaking, to get to those minute-long exposures, you will need plain filters. There's two types of filters that exist that are plain, either the square ones or rectangular, or the second one is screw-in filters. Either one of those two optically should be equivalent. However, for screw-on filters, you have to keep in mind that if you want to shoot extremely wide, you will end up in most situations seeing the outer rim of those filters, just like you see in this example here. And at that point, there's very little that you can do to fix that. Pretty much the only thing that you can do will be to crop your image, which very much defeats the purpose of shooting with a very wide angle lens. So in my opinion, square filters or rectangular filters will be actually superior to screw-on filters for that exact reason. The downside of that is that square filters are a little bit less easy to manipulate in the field. So whichever option you're choosing, whether it's going to be square filters or screw-on filters, my recommendation is to get filters that are large enough that they will basically cover all the different lenses that you will be using. So get filters that will fit the largest diameter lens you have, and buy a set of step-up rings. This way you will be able to use those filters with any of the lenses that you're using, and you will not have to buy a set of neutral density filters per lens, because those filters can be very expensive. During the daytime, just as an FYI, the filter density that you will want to buy will be anything that will allow you to do 10 stops, 13 stops, or 16 stops, or any combination of that. If you're using 3, 6, and 10 stops, that's perfect, because that really allows you to get access to any kind of exposure time that you want to shoot, therefore any type of subject that you want to capture. So let's go over a few compositional tricks that will improve your images, and some of them will actually be specific to long exposure. And this is the very first one that is actually specific to that technique, because that technique, if you're lucky enough, or if you're, how to say, patient enough that you're going back to the location enough to get the exact weather conditions that will work best for you, you can see how you can turn those clouds on the left-hand side image here. Again, this is a fraction of a second shot, so everything is frozen in place here. But you can turn these clouds as they're moving into those really cool leading lines that you can now see on the right-hand side image. And those leading lines that you're essentially creating through the use of a very slow shutter speed will all be pointing at the main subject in your image. In this case, it's going to be the bridge. Here's another example of exactly using that technique for that purpose. On the left-hand side, again, you have a regular handheld shot, while on the right-hand side, you have the long exposure. And that long exposure, I was lucky enough that day, when I was shooting that, that gate, that torii in Japan, I had the clouds that were really just plain and simple pointing at the main subject in my picture. And so this is an amazing way of now creating those leading lines that will really help support your picture and make it much easier to read for people looking at those images. And I want to stress that out, even when you don't necessarily have actual leading lines that you can create in your image, because, for instance, you don't have that really cool stump that would be creating the leading line in the foreground. Sometimes you have it, but sometimes you don't. And when you don't have it, when you can turn those clouds into those leading lines, it just makes the image, basically. It really supports it and makes a very, very powerful image. But you can actually also do both of those two things. You can use leading lines, in the foreground and in the different elements of your image to help point at the main subject in that picture, as well as also create leading lines through the use of long exposure, or through the creation of those leading lines potentially in the sky in post. So in the case of this particular picture, as you can see on the left-hand side, the picture is actually a long exposure, and it did create a very faint leading line that was actually pointing at the main subject in the picture, but it wasn't so much obvious that it really helped with creating this really simple image to read. And so I very smartly, in a way, very mischievously used some post-production tools to help me complete that creation of leading lines that the long exposure already started, right? But if I want to be even more sneaky about it, and this is 100% on the left-hand side, a long exposure picture, because you can see how already, the weeds are moving in the wind, and they're creating these really cool patterns in the foreground. Well, unfortunately, that day, I just did not have the cloud coverage that I wish I did. So I had to be sneaky, and I had to basically swap skies. I don't necessarily like doing this. Um, I would rather do it in camera if I can, but this was a trip that I had planned, and I was only going to be in this location for basically that one afternoon. And so I could have waited as long as I wanted. I would not have had clouds, so that I really had no choice but to swap out the sky. And in the case of this particular picture, I decided to use a sky that had those leading lines that were pointing at the main element in the picture, and that main element being is the lighthouse. The other thing that I absolutely love to do with long exposure uh, and also in post is to completely reshape the light. So when you're shooting a specific location, a specific subject, again, you're not necessarily going to be there for a very long amount of time. You can't necessarily go back there very easily. So when that happens, I will basically use my image almost as a canvas that I'm going to be adjusting, I'm going to be editing so that I end up having the picture that I imagined in my mind, in a way, no matter what the light conditions are when I'm in the field. Of course, I'd rather be shooting in the perfect light conditions. But again, sometimes we're photographers, we have to make do with, the conditions that are served uh, to us. And as you can see in this particular set of images, on the left-hand side, you have essentially my raw picture, while on the right-hand side, you have the fully edited image. And you can see how I created this vignette all around the outside of my picture. That's going to really create a gradient of light where the brightest in my image is going to be where my main subject is located. And this is also typically what you want to do, and I'll get back to that later, where when you have the highest contrast is where the focus of your picture is going to be, where you want people to look at. But I also decided to reshape the light, in the foreground as well, where I created these gradient of lights where I'm going from the left to the right here, or the bottom to the top. And it's all creating gradients that are basically all bringing the eye toward where my main subject is located. And so this is what I mean by reshaping light in post. And here's another example of that, which is completely different. As you can see, that was shot, that was captured in the daytime. But I really wanted to give my final image this feel of, how to say, tension in the picture. I wanted to give also a sense of mystery in the picture, which means that I decided to darken the background of the picture, and that the only contrast that I would have, the highest contrast in my image would be focused on the one subject that I wanted people to look at. And that one subject is the pole here of that bridge, with also, again, all these leading lines, whether they're created because of the subject that I'm shooting, all these wires pointing at the pile of the tree, or because you have those leading lines again in the background that are also pointing at my main subject in the picture. So as I mentioned, you're essentially building contrast in post while you're editing your picture as well. And here's another idea, actually even pushing what I just mentioned further. And that goes back to the beginning of the presentation, where I mentioned that fine art really doesn't have to do with the tool that you're using or even the medium that you're using. It can be photography, it can be sketching, it can be painting, all kinds of, types of media um, are able to basically turn into fine arts. And this is what I'm showing you in this particular slide. So what you see on the top right-hand corner of this slide here is basically one of the fundamental concepts of sketching, but also painting that students learn throughout their studies, if they learn the fine arts, right? So what they learn is that you are able to build volume, you are able to build contrast and bring out that volume, bring out that contrast in your sketching, in your painting. And I'm pushing that concept to photography. So what I decided to do in this case is to basically increase the contrasts in the different parts of my images so that they basically match with one area that is how to say, that has highlights in conjunction with another area in my picture that actually has shadows. And where you're creating highlights and shadows next to one another, you're creating contrast. And that contrast now is creating volume in your image. So you're bringing back that third dimension, of the volume in the picture. And also, if you remember before what I mentioned, now the fourth dimension is going to be time through the long exposure, because you're going to be blurring out the elements that are moving in the picture. It's not necessarily exactly the case in this particular example, but this is just to show you how you can bring back those dimensions that by definition photography essentially crushes, just completely removes. Here you're able to bring them back. And um, here you have a picture where on top of bringing the volume in my subject, I'm also adding and modifying the light, how it basically behaves in that particular picture. I decided to create that vignette to help again focus the attention a little bit more on the main subject in the picture. And eventually I created this black and white version. So when I actually captured that picture, or rather even before I captured that picture, I already had in my mind the idea of what I wanted that image to look like in black and white, the image that you can see in this particular picture, or slide, I should say. Here's another example of building volume in post. As you can see on the left-hand side, it is the long exposure picture that I'm showing you already. It is a pretty cool shot on its own, but I did decide to emphasize the volume of the building and also to darken quite dramatically the background in the picture so that I would bring up the contrast, bring up even further the volume in the picture, and really basically create that image that was very easy for people to read and know where I wanted them to look. So that kind of brings me to this whole idea of how um, by stepping away from reality even further, and what I mean by that is by converting your images from color to black and white, it's actually even giving you more creative freedom than just to stick with your color images. And here's what I mean by that. So here you have the picture, which is also a long exposure image. I think it's about half a second from memory. I'm sorry I didn't put it the exposure time here, but you have the color image here. It's already a pretty cool shot. I really like it, but at the end of the day, I am able from that shot to decide if I'm going to create a black and white image that's going to be more on the left-hand side, where, you know, because it's high key, it's very zen, it's very quiet, it really almost brings out this feeling of being soothing, or I could actually decide to go to edit my image and turn it into this very contrasty uh, picture where, because you have this extremely strong contrast, extremely strong vignette, now I'm bringing this sense of how to say um, a sense of mystery and tension in my images. And so there's really no right and wrong here. You are more than welcome to go either way when it comes to editing, or you can go even anywhere in between. It's totally fine to go to do that because you're going to be the one deciding that based on what you're seeing and based on the feeling that you want to convey through the image that you're working on. Here's another example of this idea where on the left-hand side, you can see the picture where basically, again, it's handheld. You can see people walking by. Everything is frozen in time. In the middle, you have the long exposure picture that is transforming that fountain into this really, really cool, very misty, drape-like, how to say, um, element in the picture. And the long exposure is also transforming those clouds into these really cool in this case, high contrast streaks that are actually going to be framing the main subject in the picture, where I will want people to spend the most time looking, which is that particular building here, somewhat on the left half of the picture. And on the right-hand side, I used all these different techniques I mentioned earlier. I completely used the original picture as basically the canvas to change it entirely, to make it my own, to step away from reality and to convey that very personal vision of mine by creating volume, by using the long exposure to create those really cool streaks, bring up the contrast and the luminosity in the fountain. So I'm just really using basically what I'm seeing, what I'm capturing as a canvas uh, to my personal vision, right? So the last few slides of the presentation that I have really are to focus on a couple examples of the workflow from me going from my initial image, the initial color raw picture that I shot, with my camera, all the way to the final product. And you will see that I can, if need be, I can go pretty far with that. But again, I go pretty far with it because I'm not documenting what I'm seeing. I'm really using what I'm seeing as a canvas for my imagination, for my creativity, and for whatever feeling I want to express, whatever story I want to share with the people looking at my images. So let's start with this one picture, which, as you will see, I did not start at all with this. This is the final image, whereas this is the initial picture. As you can see, it's very, very different. So the very first thing that I do when I edit my image is to basically import it into Camera Raw. At that point, I'm going to be using all these sliders to edit my image, but overall, those modifications are global modifications for the most part. If you're familiar with Lightroom and not Camera Raw, Camera Raw is very, very similar to Lightroom, where you can basically pull the sliders one way or the other to adjust exposure, contrast, highlights, any color contrast, color temperature, any kind of those tools that you would be familiar with in Lightroom or in Capture One or any other piece of software out there essentially work pretty much the same. So at least at that point, what I'm doing is playing with the sliders to bring my image closer to what I'm going to uh, want it to look like in the end. Of course, this is still very, very far from there, but I'm going closer and closer to what I want it to look like. The next step that I'm going to take is to bring that particular image into Photoshop. Almost every piece of editing that I'm doing is in Photoshop because a lot of what I do has to do with layers, with masking. I know Lightroom got better at it, but there are still some limitations to what Lightroom allows you to do, which Photoshop does great. So because I know that I'm going to be at some point going into Photoshop, I pretty much start from almost from the beginning. So I bring my picture into Photoshop, and the next thing that I'm going to do at that point, because in my mind, I decided to create an image that was essentially minimalistic, where I'm going to have no background, is so what I decided at that point to do is to blend the sky and the ocean. And I realized that what I'm telling you here are just the main steps. I'm not actually telling you exactly what tool I'm using, how I'm doing all these things. I would love to be able to do that. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time today to do it because every single one of those steps sometimes takes me, you know, half an hour, uh, if not even more than that. If you are interested in learning how to do this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions by email. I actually also typically give out some examples, some tips and tricks in my newsletters. And I also do offer one-on-one sessions that if you're interested in, just feel free to reach out and we can discuss those. So here's the first step. As I mentioned, I remove the background. My next step that I decided to do was to actually stretch out the canvas. I could have decided to crop out my canvas, but I decided in this case to stretch it out because that will allow me to create even larger prints if I want to. And I stretched out the canvas, created pixels on the left side, a few pixels on the right side as well. And now I have this panel that's a 1:2 aspect ratio. So 1 in height by 2 in width. The next step at that point was for me to move those rocks over to the other side. The reason I did this is because the rocks being on the right-hand side and having nothing on the left-hand side here, my picture is completely unbalanced. So that's the first reason. The other reason is because, as you can see, those rocks are essentially creating pretty much leading lines, even in, how to say, they're even creating somewhat of an arrowhead that would be potentially pointing at the main subject in the picture, which is this big rock there. So now I have this arrowhead that's pointing straight at my main subject in the picture. How cool is that, right? And I was able to do that in post, while I would not have been able to do this in the field, moving one way or the other, because doing that, I would actually have had other issues, typically having the background now hiding behind that main rock. It would have made it much harder for me to remove that background in post. So I decided to stick to this specific angle that I was shooting from because I knew that I could move those rocks at the bottom. The next thing that I decided to do was to adjust the tonalities of the light overall. So this was before, and this is now. And you can see also how I reshaped in a way, how I stretched out those rocks so that they're a little bit more prominent in the picture. They're going to be a little easier for people to focus on now. And at that point, essentially, the color, quote unquote, color image looks great, in my opinion. This is the right time for me to basically kick it into Silver Effects Pro, and I'll show you that in the next slide, to start doing the black and white conversion. So the reason I said quote unquote color image here is because, as you can see, it's a pretty dull color image. You could potentially desaturate that picture and it would give you a pretty decent image already. But it's not going to be the black and white image the way that I want it to look like. And you'll see that the way that I'm doing the conversion is a slightly more involving, but also it's giving me more freedom to actually achieve the exact result that I want to get. And very often people ask me, well, why do you uh, capture images in color and edit them in color to then convert them to black and white? Well, the reason for that is because I want to be able to have a very solid color image, a very good color image, in order to make an even better black and white picture. I like to use the analogy of a house. When you're building a house, you want to have strong foundations before you start putting walls up. You don't want to start, putting walls up on a mud floor. You know that the house is going to collapse. This is exactly the same idea here um, with the color to black and white image. And I actually realized that I kept going throughout the presentation without asking if there were any questions. So let me pause here for a minute and see if Ali, you have questions for me.
Yeah, Thibault, we have some questions. You may have answered some of them, but
Okay, great.
let's go through. Here's a three-parter from Jerry.
Mhm.
He asked, are you using a converted camera?
So I do not use a converted camera, not when it comes to shooting black and white images. Excuse me. I do use converted cameras when I shoot infrared, but to make it simpler for the whole purpose and intent of this presentation, which is essentially color to black and white, I do not use a converted um, camera to straight to black and white, because as you will see in the next few slides, I want to be able to have the freedom of converting the color image exactly to what I want in black and white. And using a converted camera, essentially you can think of it as just desaturating your image. Pretty much s- you're pretty much stuck to one version, one conversion, one black and white view of the picture that you're trying to, or the subject you're trying to shoot. The whole idea behind me converting from color to black and white is because it allows me, if you remember that one slide that I showed you earlier with the wind turbine, to decide whether I'm going to go very high key, very low key, or anywhere between. If I'm using a converted camera, I'm stuck to one thing pretty much.
Okay, and then Thibault, I think you
Mhm.
answered this one. Are you using Nick Silver FX Pro?
Yes, I am, and I will show you in the next slide, the highlights of how I use it.
Okay. And then here's a question from Bob. You may answer in the next slide. What is your favorite software for black and white conversion?
Yep, it is Nick Silver Effects.
Okay, and then we just had a few more questions come through.
Sure.
I don't know if you want to save them to the end or come on now.
Yeah, let's maybe keep going for until the end of this image, and we'll see how far we are and how much time we have
Sure.
at that point. All right. So, as I just mentioned, I do love Nick Silver Effects. It is a really great piece of software. Um, Essentially, the way it works is that you can use it as a standalone, or most probably you will be using it, and I pretty much always use it as a plugin for Photoshop. On the right-hand side here, you have the user interface of that piece of software. And what you can see in green over here on the left-hand side is basically a number of small images, small versions in black and white of the color image that you just um, basically kicked into Nick Silver Effects. Um, these are presets. As you can see, there are very different renderings. And what I recommend is to pick whichever one of those is actually going to be closest to the final rendering of the image that you're imagining in your head, right? So if I want to go with a very high key image, for instance, I'm going to pick the picture that you see here that says 20. If I want a very dark image, I'm going to pick the one that says 15 here, right? So this very first one will be my first base layer. But before I go there, on the right-hand side, let me tell you a little bit more about it. It is, again, a system with a slider. So just like with Lightroom, you're able to pull and push the sliders any which way for any of those settings that you can think about, whether it's brightness, it can be the brightness of the highlights or the brightness of the midtones or shadows. You can change the contrasts, you can change, the what's it called? The level of details in your image, depending if it's highlight, midtones, or shadows again, or any other other settings that you have available with that piece of software. And all these different sliders, they will basically be um, global over your image. There are ways to do things a little bit uh, more not, I shouldn't say precisely, but locally in the image by using what's called a control point. Typically, I personally don't use those because they're very, very hard to handle if you realize, for instance, that you made a mistake and you need to go back and adjust things unless you've actually used this piece of software to create a new layer that will be converted into what's called a smart object, which is something that you can go back to and re-edit the changes that you've made. Unless you're using smart objects, if you're using just regular layers, it's pretty much impossible to go back and just change ever so slightly one little thing for that layer. So that's why I like to use local modifications within Photoshop itself and not within Nik, Silver Effects. So anyways, long story short is this is my color picture. I push it into Silver Effects, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to pick again that preset that's going to be closest to what I want my picture to look like. And it turns it into this. The next step is to go back to my color picture, which exists still as a layer because I haven't destroyed it. Everything that I'm doing is non-destructive. And I'm pushing it back into Nik, Silver Effects. And then I'm going to select a different version of the black and white conversion. Maybe I'm going to be picking one that, say, has slightly darker sky because I'm going to be using part of the sky, for instance, the top of the sky, to create my vignette, right? To create my gradient of luminosity where it's going to be darker up top of the sky versus in the middle of the picture. Or it can be any other reason that I want to create other layers. Maybe, for instance, the rocks are just too dark here, and I want to bring in more luminosity in the rock. So I'm going to go back to my color image, again, push it into Silver Effects. In Silver Effects, I'm going to change the preset. I may or may not also change the sliders that I showed you earlier. And then I'm going to click OK. And that layer is going to be back into Photoshop. And this is what you see here, where I brought a version of basically that image, that conversion, where only the rocks were brighter. Everything else basically was the same. And I may do yet another one where, in this case, if you look at the left-hand side here of the image, you see how the sky is slightly different, and so on and so forth, right? I'm going to be creating any number of layers until I have everywhere in my image part of each one of those image layers, each one of those layers for each part of my final image that will look like what I want it to look like, right? And at the end of the day, I'm going to take all these different layers. Maybe I'm going to have 10 of them. Maybe I'm just going to have 2 of them. And I'm going to use masks in order to merge them all together. And when they're all merged together, I may be doing some very small last adjustments. For instance, here where I brought a little bit more contrast in the rocks by bringing a little bit more shadows in the rocks. And at that point, I'm done. This is the picture that I initially, even before I captured it, that I had in my mind. So I know it's a whole workflow. It's how to say, it's something that takes a lot of time to grasp, but it using all these different techniques create, I mean, just completely opens up creative freedom. It's just absolutely amazing what you're able to do with these different techniques. So Ali, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, Thibault. Here's a question about filters.
Mm-hmm.
If we use a screw-on ND filter, should we remove the UV filter that's over our lens to protect it, even if the UV filter is high quality?
So that would be my recommendation, but probably not for the reason that you may think about. Um, the reason that I recommend removing it is because the more filters you will stack on top of one another, the more vignetting. Remember the example that I showed you at the beginning where you have those edges that are clipped? Well, those rings will come further and further inside your image the more you have uh, filters that are basically stacked on top of one another, which means that it will force you more and more to crop your image. Um, so that's really the reason why I recommend not using them. But if you're thinking in terms of optical quality, if you're using good filters, and I know that good filters is kind of a loaded definition, loaded question at that point, because what is a good filter? Um, but if they're good, optically good quality, there should be essentially no issues stacking them together. Um, any other issues but the vignetting, that is.
And then a similar question from
Mhm.
Matthew. For someone just getting started with long exposure photography,
Yes,
what would you recommend as the first ND filter to purchase?
that's a fantastic question. Thanks for asking it because, it, you know, filters are expensive. I get it. Ideally, you want to have a set of filters, but you don't necessarily want to commit to that, or you can't necessarily commit to that. And it's in particular, if you don't even know you're going to like the technique. So if there's only one filter to get, if you want to do daytime long exposure, just like everything that I've shown you in this presentation, the one filter that I recommend would be 13 stops filter, because this way um, you are able to adjust settings on your camera about 3 stops one way, 3 stops the other way to have as much versatility as you would get with only one stop. Is it going to be the exact same optical quality as having a set of different filters? No. You may run into some issues like diffraction or things like that if you have to close the aperture too much. But at least it will give you the versatility that you can shoot more subjects in more light conditions than any other filter, that is. So 13.
A question from Sergio.
Mhm.
How do you determine how long to keep the shutter open?
That's also a great question. And I pretty much have almost a whole presentation on just that idea. But very simply put, it completely depends on the subject that you're shooting and what is going to be moving in your picture. If you're shooting, say, a car that's driving very, very fast, to be able to get the movement of the car or completely blur it out, you're not going to need to shoot for very long. If now you have that same car that's moving extremely slow, you can think, you can imagine how much of a slower shutter speed you're going to need to use in order to blur it out or to make it completely disappear. And that's totally the case if you're shooting, say, those clouds. Those clouds may be moving very, very slow, but in the same, frame, you're going to have, say, those branches that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, that are going to be moving faster because there's a lot of wind. So depending in of whether you want to blur out both of those two, the branches and the clouds, in that case, I would shoot with a very, very slow shutter speed because again, the clouds are moving very, very slowly. Or you may decide to actually just be blurring out the branches of the tree, in which case you don't need to have such a slow shutter speed. You will have the branches of the tree blurred out, but the clouds will not be blurred out. So it's really dependent on what element you have in your picture, how fast they're shooting, and what is your intent, right? You will be the one deciding if you want to blur out those clouds or not.
A question from Joyce.
Mhm.
Do you apply your gradients in Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, or in Photoshop?
Um, I will from time to time already apply gradients in Camera Raw, meaning, pretty much the same you could say in Lightroom. However, for the most of my editing is done in Photoshop. And so when I do gradients, typically I will do them in Photoshop, also because that will bring more opportunities for me to be more precise and more versatile. It's going to be easier for me to, for instance, create a gradient that is not going to be completely centered on the picture, but actually offset one side or another. And maybe I want my gradient to be a little bit stronger, from the top than it is from the bottom. And I'm able to do this very, very easily in Photoshop, while Lightroom is still not quite so intuitive and easy to do.
And a question from John.
Mhm.
Can you speak to combining shorter exposures together to create the long exposure effect, allowing
Yes.
for when no ND is available, or shorter versions which can be added until a particular level of blur is achieved?
Yeah, so that's also a really cool thing that you can do. It's a lot of fun to be um, combining different exposures, because sometimes, you know, you may want, especially with seascapes, for instance, clouds typically are going to be moving fairly slowly, relatively speaking, to waves. Waves are pretty fast, right? Like within a second or two, usually the wave has, you know, broken on the rocks, for instance. And so you may want, so when you do a long exposure and you want to have the effect of the clouds movement, you know you're going to want to be shooting very slowly. Typically, it's going to be maybe 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. Within that time, that's enough time, that's enough for the waves to basically have almost completely disappeared. So you see there that there's a problem. If you look at it the other way around, where if you still want to have some movement in the waves, it means that you're going to need to be shooting under a second. Under a second, there's no movement of the clouds pretty much whatsoever. And again, it's in that case, it's going to be pretty much one or the other. You can't really pick both unless you're actually shooting in camera those two pictures, meaning that potentially you're going to have multiple ND filters, one that lets you shoot under a second, another one that lets you shoot over a minute. Let's assume you do have those. You are able to shoot under a second, over a minute. If you've shot those two images exactly from the same location without moving between one shot and another, which means that you have used a tripod, you are able in post to bring the first picture, bring the other, so the short picture, the long picture in, say, Photoshop. I'm sure these days now, Lightroom is able to do these kind of things as well. And you can consider those two different exposures as two different layers. And now you are able to use masks to just bring in the clouds from one layer and the waves from the other layer and create that final image with both of them. But that means, again, that you need to have exactly the same point of view, because if you change point of views, it's going to make things very, very hard, because you would be changing perspectives, and that's something really tough to fix. And typically, it will also mean, like I said earlier, that you're going to have to use multiple neutral density filters to allow you to shoot those drastically different exposure times. But that's kind of the idea. And it's a really fun thing to do.
Okay, Thibault, let's take two more questions. Tom
Sounds good.
says, I own 3 square filters, 1 neutral density that has a number 6. So assuming 6 stops, I also own 2 graduated neutral density filters. Could the 3 of these be combined? One of the NDs would be upside down to get a long exposure.
In theory, sure. In practice, it sounds like it's going to be pretty annoying to figure out exactly where those two filters, graduated filters, need to go so that, how to say, in the middle of the two, you don't have more light, or you don't have actually even less light. So in theory, yes, you can do it. In practice, I think it's probably going to be really annoying to do. I'm not sure I would do that. I would just probably get another plain filter and figure it out that way. It's going to be easier for you. There's a lot that needs to be remembered when it comes to the whole process of shooting long exposures. And so my recommendation is try to do everything that will help you get the final shot. try to make everything as easy for yourself as possible. If you're making things harder for yourself, it's going to be very frustrating.
Okay, and then Thibault, one final question. Let's take this one from D. Saunders.
Okay.
I notice you use different cameras. How did you make your decision to use which one for which image?
So a lot of it has to do with some of those pictures were shot several years ago. So at that time, basically, I was using the quote unquote best camera that I could get my hands on and afford that would allow me to capture those images. The more recent images were shot with, say, the Sony A1 or A7R5 because, for instance, the R5 only came out, I think, last November or something like that. So that's pretty much the main reason. However, some of the cameras I may use because, for instance, I have an A7R4 that I have converted to infrared. And so because this is a very, very special camera that just allows me to do a certain type of photography, certain effects in the photography that, you know, the final image that I get from it. In that case, that would be a reason why I would be picking this one versus the A1, for instance. But typically, it's just because I've upgraded my cameras.
All right, Thibault, that looks like the end of the time we have today, but
All
we
right.
have a BenQ. Huge thank you to you. We always love having you present.
Thank
I look
you.
forward to the next one.
Yeah, likewise. And if I have just a minute, I would like to go quickly towards, oh gosh, it doesn't let me do this. So let's do it a different way. I just wanted to share this one slide over here where basically I'm going to be running a couple of workshops in October. They're both 3-day in-depth workshops on long exposure. I will also be talking about black and white photography. There's a classroom session. One is in Eastern Washington in the Palouse area, which is, as you can see here, a lot of, you know, crops. It's very country. It's very much a countryside over there. The other one is going to be along the Oregon coast. It's going to be the South Oregon coast between essentially Bandon and Brookings. There are some absolutely beautiful sea stacks and sea sceneries over there. And if you have any question, if you're interested in some of what I mentioned earlier, which are possibly some one-on-one sessions, editing sessions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to answer emails, you know, if you have some simple questions, and you can also sign up for my newsletters on my website, where I will also talk about the events that are coming up, such as this one, but also my workshops. And I also share some tips and some of my fine art work, depending on what you're interested in. So yeah, and again, thank you so much, Ali and BenQ, for making this presentation, this event happen. Thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you to everyone who will be viewing this presentation in the next days and weeks.
Thank you, Thibault. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.